everyone. I guess it's always a bit of a challenge to bring people back from a lunch break, but I'll get this thing started in the interest of time. So, what I intend to do over the course of the next 25 or 30 minutes is talk about obviously entrepreneurship, given that it's the topic of this this event over the next 2 days. But sort of to set the stage for the next 2 days, what I wanted to do is give a little bit of context. I think as entrepreneurs, and many of you here in the audience are entrepreneurs, we do not operate in an island. We operate in the context of a regional environment, we operate in the context of a global environment, and we operate in the context of a global economy. And that's something we need to recognize, because it also helps us understand the opportunity we're addressing in a more tangible way. So I'll actually first start with the macro backdrop. Where are we today as a global economy? And then I'll focus more on regional aspects and issues around entrepreneurship. So today, the state of the world is probably in a very fragile state, more than it has been for years. Probably for most of us in this room, the state of the world economy is in its most fragile state that we have ever seen. I think it is very important to recognize that and to be cognizant of that. So how did we get into the situation we're in as a global economy, and what does that mean in terms of opportunity for us that are in emerging markets and us in MENA markets specifically? We're all aware of the situation that was created by leverage building up over the years, where consumption and economic growth were fueled by increased levels of leverage and credit expansion, and we're talking both corporate expansion and as well as consumer spending as a result of leverage. And suddenly that bubble burst, and when that bubble burst, it made a very different dynamic. Suddenly the developed markets were slowing down, and what happened was we saw an acceleration of growth in emerging markets, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So we look at developed markets. These have been the drivers of economic growth, at least for the past few centuries. So when you look at the US today, you're expecting a growth rate of about 2% over the next few years. Although the deleveraging cycle has happened, you're still seeing we're at very, very high levels, and will continue through this deleveraging cycle for a long period of time. So the challenge about restoring growth will remain for some time to come. So there's been substantial wealth destruction as far as the US economy is concerned. Today, job creation is a major challenge, as it is in other parts of the world, and the levels of growth that are happening aren't exactly helping to correct the situation. Now, you move over to the other side of the pond and you look at Europe, and it's just as challenging, if not more. As a matter of fact, there's significantly more challenge around growth in Europe, and the significant difference between the ability to recover is that Europe is a monetary union but not a fiscal union, so the ability to pull yourself out of a challenge is a lot more complex in terms of creating a decisive direction for the economy to grow. So I think it creates an interesting backdrop, because what you're seeing right now is a massive transformation in terms of where growth is coming from. And growth is coming from markets that we have historically not associated with growth. It's coming from what people call emerging markets, of which MENA is a very critical component. It's coming from what we like to call global growth markets as opposed to emerging markets, because we feel that these are markets that have emerged. These are markets that are strong. And I think all of us that operate in these markets today are privileged to be going through these transformational times. And just to give you a bit of an illustration, if you take a 200+ year timeline and you look at where growth historically came from, it used to come from what today are called global growth markets. The bulk of world growth used to come out of Asia, India, China, and developed markets were about 30% of world growth. That reversed over a period of time, where we are today, where probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the world economy comes from developed markets, and about 1/3 or 1/4 comes from what people call emerging markets, what we call global growth markets. But I think the interesting trend is who's growing faster, and you're starting to see a reversal of this trend line, and increasingly the markets that we operate in, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's Asia, or indeed for that matter Latin America, these are markets where you're seeing the bulk of the growth. In fact, 2/3 to 3/4 of world growth, not the world economy, the growth is coming from these markets. So if I compress this to a shorter time frame, just probably 30 years, and this is during the course of the lifetime of pretty much most of us in this room, and in some cases during the course of the professional lifetime of some of us in this room, you'll see that that evolution has happened in a very accelerated fashion. So from 1981 to 1991, we saw that global growth markets, or what we call emerging markets, grew at about half the rate of developed markets. So the US, Europe were growing at fairly rapid clips, and emerging markets were challenged. They were growing at half the growth rate. And then something happened in the mid-90s, and I'll talk about the factors that helped reverse this later. But what happened is you suddenly found that from the mid-90s to where we are now, emerging markets as a group, whether it's MENA, whether it's Asia, whether it's Africa, have grown at three times the rate of developed nations. There's a combination of events that has happened during that period. There's been the financial crisis, but more importantly, it's around the economic reforms and the growth that these countries have experienced, which led them to have the growth rates that's substantially larger than developed markets. And I think the interesting thing, and I think relevant to all of us here in this room, is that we will continue to see these growth rates going forward. In fact, what we're seeing is that for the next 5 years or so, that most of the growth will come from these markets, and it will continue to grow at 3.5 to 4 times where developed markets are. So let's map it out and let's define it. What people call emerging markets and what I'm calling here today global growth markets. What are these markets? And I put up this slide. And if you pause for a moment and look at this slide, and you look at the blue shaded areas, it's interesting because it's supposed to indicate countries that are growing at 3% or more in the next few years. So these are going 3%, 5%, 6% plus. And the interesting thing is it maps almost directly into what we call global growth markets, or what people have called emerging markets. It's the markets of Africa. It's the markets of MENA. So despite all the negative headlines you sometimes hear about MENA, you look at that chart and they are core growth markets. It's the markets of Asia. So there's a very, very interesting dynamic. And then you look at the markets of North America, Europe, the so-called developed world, and there are challenges around growth. These are markets that are not growing at all, or growing very slowly, and in the case of Japan, even contracting, and in some places in Europe. So the macro is something that we as entrepreneurs should be very cognizant of. This is the operating environment you're in. This is why there is an opportunity in the markets we're in. That the overall picture, despite the noise and despite the headline factor and the news factor, there's very strong growth in these markets, albeit with challenges that we'll get into later. So why are we seeing this growth? There's a number of factors, and I highlighted perhaps a 10-year period from the mid-90s to where we are today. And you'll notice that a lot of the countries that are seeing this growth have embarked upon significant economic reform. Whether you see countries like Turkey, which had an aggressive economic reform program, Indonesia, Mexico, Nigeria, the Middle East, and most of the Arab countries, there was a strong commitment around economic reform and opening up the economy to the private sector and creating private sector growth. It's a journey, and it's a long journey, and it will have bumps along the road, but it pays off. That is why you see the growth that you see today, despite some of the challenges. The second factor that you see is urbanization. We live in a very vibrant city. For those of you who live in Dubai, you realize the impact of how cities create these very dynamic consumption cultures. Today, most of the consumption and most of the urbanization is coming from the movement into major cities across emerging markets. You're seeing cities of 5 million plus, 10 million plus, or 1 million even plus across markets in Asia, markets in Africa, increasing urbanization, and then this leads to a consumption cycle that is very, very positive for business. The other thing you see is the growing middle class. In fact, speaking of the growing middle class, in the next 20 years or so, there's about 1.4 billion people from emerging markets or global growth markets that are entering the middle class. That is more than the entire population of the developed markets, just to give you an order of magnitude. So by definition, this is a whole new breed of consumers that is coming into the market. These are people that are going to consume everything from online shopping to buying white goods to buying property to consuming meals in restaurants to buying mobile phone services. So this is a whole new breed of consumers that is happening mostly in emerging markets. And these are markets that all of you sitting in this room are trying to target and address through the products and services that you offer. And the demographics also work in favor of these emerging economies, MENA or otherwise. Today, these are populations which are typically, in the case of MENA, 50% are under the age of 25. So not only are they consuming, they're going to be consuming next year, the year after, and for the next 25, 30 years. These are long consumption cycles, and again, you combine all of these factors, the urbanization, the growing middle class, the demographics, the nature of all that, and you recognize the kind of consumption opportunity there is. Because historically, people have looked at emerging markets or global growth markets, and they would say, you know, this is a resource story. It's about selling oil and gas in the case of the Middle East. It's about minerals and resources in Africa. No, Africa is going to be a $1 trillion economy very soon. The Middle East is 350 million consumers. That is about the population of the US, but these are young consumers, so the potential is substantial. So, putting this in perspective, just to give you some live examples of countries and the impact from the economic reforms and the growth they're seeing. Today, Turkey is the 16th largest economy in the world. If you talk to somebody about Turkey in the late 80s, they would tell you this was an example of how not to run an economy. It would have been an example of a failed economy to a very large extent. Today, it is seen as a darling of emerging markets. It is a very strong economy, and it's one with young, strong consumers, and is very well positioned between Asia and Europe. You look in, taking an example from Asia, you look at a country like Indonesia, and the number here is incorrect. I mean, it's 45 million growing to 135 million. That's not double, that's triple the size of where it is today. By 2030, you'll have triple the number of consumers. And that consuming class comes from population growth, but also comes from people entering into the middle class and thus having the ability to spend and consume. So you look at sub-Saharan Africa, I mentioned, this is going to be a $1 trillion economy by 2020. You cannot ignore that. That's a very large market, and there's big populations in centers such as, whether it's a Lagos or a Nairobi or a Johannesburg or other markets in sub-Saharan Africa. It is not the perception that most people have in their mind. And these are markets you can address, especially today, that an entrepreneur can address markets in the periphery, not just in their home markets. You look at Latin America, again, it's the same story. You take an example such as Colombia, you're doubling the middle class, literally doubling the middle class over the past 10 years. And the impact that will have on businesses there and the growth that you see in businesses there. So people have already noted these trends and taken advantage of them. And you know, I'm sure most of you in these rooms are taking advantage of these trends in your markets, but I think the multinationals are taking note as well. And I put this slide just to give you an idea that it's not just about being local that you see this opportunity. Global firms recognize it. Today, you look at Coca-Cola. 50% of its revenue since 2006 is generated in growth markets. It's not in the US, it's not in Europe, it's not in Japan. It's happening in the countries of Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Today, when Procter & Gamble is constructing its new factories, 19 of the 20 new factories that they've constructed in the past period were built in global growth markets because they want to be closer to the consumers. They want to simplify the logistics, and they want to make sure that they are as close to their markets as they can be. They recognize that's where the growth is. Their production in developed markets is going to potentially face challenges around consumption. You look at companies like Unilever's, the multinationals that get it, that are attracting consumers, selling everything from tea to biscuits and everything else. Not only does 50% of the revenue come from growth markets, but they expect that to be about 70% by 2020. So these are all numbers and statistics that we can't ignore. And how does that translate into SMEs? I think the important thing is, as this private sector opens up in these economies, the most adaptive and nimble firms are not going to be the conglomerates. They're not going to be the family holding groups. They're not going to be the big diversified industrials, and they're not going to be the state-owned entities. The most flexible and dynamic businesses are going to be SMEs because they will recognize the opportunity, they will act on the opportunity, and I'm sure many of you sitting again in this room will notice that sometimes, although it's not 100% level playing field and you face challenges competing against the big guys, you are able to adapt your business quicker and faster to the opportunity. And for those who can outmaneuver, they tend to do extremely well. And why is this critical? I think in order to continue the growth rates we're looking at, the growth will have to come from the private sector. And the private sector has to start somewhere. And usually that somewhere is small. If you look at, I mean, if we look at the US and you look at the top 10 companies by market cap today, again, most of them started in our lifetime. Whether it's a Google, whether it's an Apple, whether it's, you can think of a number of companies. These happened on our watch. And these companies have grown on our watch. They started out as two people in a garage, you know, just as an anecdote. But that is, these are businesses that have been built over the past 10, 15 years, sometimes 20 years, but basically over a short period of time. So as the private sector plays a more active role, especially in businesses where you can be disruptive, there's a growing need for SMEs. And why do we need that? Because frankly, and it's been the subject of debate probably around forums like these for the past 10 years, is around creating the employment opportunities. Without creating the economic growth in countries in MENA or otherwise, you will not be able to absorb the populations that we're talking about. So on the one hand, I'm saying there's young and growing populations, which is a terrific opportunity for consumers, but on the other hand, you have to actually create jobs for them, or else it cuts the other way. So you have to create that kind of opportunity, especially the challenges around youth unemployment. Today, 25% of youth in MENA are unemployed. They need an employment opportunity, and guess what? The government isn't going to create all these jobs. So investment in private enterprise is going to create these jobs. So there's been a mismatch, and I don't think the challenge in emerging markets is around low growth, because the growth is there, even if it has slowed down in the past few years, and we see a little bit of a rebound recently. It's not a challenge around growth. It's a challenge around mismatch. It's about matching the talent with the opportunity. It's about recalibrating your economy to be more diversified. Do you want to be, say, a resource-dependent economy and have all the volatility that comes with it, with a single export? At the end of the day, commodity prices fluctuate. So one day you'll have a good year, and another day you'll have a very challenging year. So unless you diversify the economy, and no better way to do it than through small and medium enterprises and other entrepreneurial activities, then it becomes a massive challenge. So it's extremely important to create that kind of diversification. And I think the policymakers around the region get it. You know, we've been talking about these challenges, as I said, about the need to create 100 million jobs in the Arab world and everything else for years and years and years. But it just manifested itself recently into Arab Spring with all the challenges that brings. So I think what has happened is now what was on the agenda has bubbled up to the top and now is front of mind and is something that's much more pressing, and governments get it. That's why they're spending on infrastructure, they're spending on encouraging a level playing field for business to start. They're spending and recognizing the need for SMEs, and I think the UAE specifically has seen this a long time ago, and it's been working towards creating an environment that attracts not just local capital, but international capital and international talent. And I think recently we've seen with the recent passing of the laws and regulations around SMEs that there has been a vision to make it even more so, to allow businesses to enter markets easily and, as importantly, exit markets easily. So SMEs are the growth engines of any economy around us. They are basically the test that allows us to test whether an economy works or doesn't. And they create innovative and disruptive business models and take us forward and create employment opportunities. And there's tons of data out there that supports that SMEs drive growth. I think I was reading something the other day, I think about 2 days ago, that 60% of economic growth coming out of the UAE has been from what is classified as SMEs, and that number has doubled over the past few years. So we need to recognize the role they play. We need to also celebrate some of these examples and recognize that these are success stories that we need to celebrate to encourage more and more people, not just to be entrepreneurs, because not everybody in the room can be an entrepreneur, but to at least understand that working for an entrepreneurial enterprise is a very promising opportunity as well. You don't have to work for a big corporation. As a matter of fact, your growth profile within a successful entrepreneurial enterprise is potentially much more rewarding than working through corporate. And as the Abraaj Group, as private equity investors in global growth markets, I think we're very lucky in that our job involves identifying entrepreneurs, supporting entrepreneurs, investing with entrepreneurs, and as a fairly entrepreneurial organization ourselves, it's interesting because our own success is built on the success of multiple success stories that we identify and support. So we extract our success from the businesses we invest in. And I thought, at the end of the day, it might help show some examples of businesses and take you a little bit on a journey. And I realize I'm cognizant of the time constraints. Take you on a little bit of a journey of what are the kind of businesses you can see in MENA or in some of the other geographies that we invest in, just as examples of the impact they can have. So we start off, say, our journey with a stop in Tunisia. And you look at Tunisia, relatively small country, but a dynamic economy, and with a reasonable sense of entrepreneurship, especially on the SME side. A business called Opalia, these are a manufacturer of generic drugs in Tunisia. We found this business a while back where the entrepreneur behind the business was a pharmacist, and she could have chosen the traditional corporate life of a pharmacist and continued to do what she was doing as a pharmacist, and that's a very safe, reasonably rewarding job in a country like Tunisia. But she saw the business opportunity in generic drugs, and she set up her business, which today employs 250 Tunisians, is a very profitable business, generates 13% of its business through exports, but more important, supplies the domestic market because there's a massive domestic need. Her company over the past five years has grown 15% year on year, and it's a very competitive business. Today, she's seeing a lot of strategic industry interest from global pharma producers who want access to the Tunisian market, and she will end up having been a very successful and hopefully a wealthy entrepreneur, and then we succeed in the process of making her successful as well. We continue this journey, move over to Nairobi, not necessarily MENA, but I think it's an interesting example of the opportunity in Africa. Brookside Dairy is a business that is in the dairy sector. Since we've invested in this business, milk production has increased by 17% every single year. So today, it is the largest producer in East Africa, and it basically exports not only to all of East Africa and supplies the Kenyan market, but also exports to some markets in Northern Africa as well. But the important thing is, it's not just the impact on the immediate business, but the feeder industries that go into this business. Brookside Dairy collects from 145,000 different farmers and cooperatives across East Africa. They source their dairy from small farmers and have created opportunity and touched the lives of each of these 145,000 farmers who now have a viable business through a customer that reaches out to them and treats them fairly and gives them a good market price for the business they're in. So the employment impact in Brookside itself, the employment impact on the feeder industries are substantial, and the business is a profitable, strong, and growing business with substantial impact on a community that needs that kind of impact. An old example, and I think it's relevant, but comes from this region, and I think what people don't realize sometimes with entrepreneurial ventures is the amount of time and hard work you put in. It's not about, you sometimes hear about success stories that happen at a very rapid period of time, but Maktoub is a story, even when we invested back in 2005, and that's 7 years ago, they'd been at it for 5 or 6 years. So we're talking about 12, 15 years invested time-wise from the entrepreneurs in making this business happen. And I think we filled that intermediate step between identifying a regional opportunity of some very strong entrepreneurs that saw the online opportunity in the Arab market, and between more international money coming in to back it and take it to the next stage, and eventually, as you all know and everybody in this room knows, successfully exiting to Yahoo. And also, these entrepreneurs have been, these entrepreneurs today are their own angel investors, helping support other entrepreneurs in the region. There's many other successful examples in this room of people who are doing that. So, finally, let's take it to Palestine, where we invested in a very small business, and it's growing today. And I think the video helps illustrate and makes it more, I guess you can touch more the kind of examples that we impact. So, put away.
For the past 70 years, the Nseba family has been farming lands in Al-Oja village in the Jericho district. Over the years, the family business evolved through years of political turmoil. In 2008, the farm started to plant a niche product: fresh herbs. The farm has grown to become one of the highest quality fresh herbs producer in Palestine. Already established in terms of quality and market, the farm needed to grow in size, upgrade infrastructure, and acquire a finishing facility. This growth required significant capital, which was not conventionally available in Palestine. In 2011, the farm became the first investment for the Palestine Growth Capital Fund, and the transformation began. Today, the farm has been restructured into a business under the brand Thamar, with management systems, corporate team, and operational processes in place. The investment allows the company to grow the farm 3 times in terms of cultivated land, with more growth planned in the coming 2 years. Additional work is underway to build the finishing facilities, sorting, packing, storing facilities for herbs and fresh produce. Thamar currently employs 140 workers, up from 45, and will reach 240 workers at full capacity, and continues to grow exports to the USA and Europe, with a market entry to the GCC expected this spring.
بوجود التوسع اللي احنا صار مع شراكتنا مع شركة ريادة، اليوم في عندنا 140 عامل. 140 عامل يعني 140 عائلة. 140 عائلة في المجتمع الفلسطيني بنحكي عن 600 فرد.
احنا بنشكرهم على هالمشروع اللي اتاح فرصة للشباب والستات اللي في بيوتهن مش لاقيات فرص عمل.
وفرت لي فرصة عمل ووفرت لناس كثير انهم يجي يشتغلوا بيها ويساهموا بالعمل هان.
كونها يعني حديثة العهد، يعني مش من زمان، لكنها قطعة شوط ممتاز في الانتاج والاستيراد في تصدير المنتجات، وبكفي انها شركة وطنية.
خلال 18 سنة احنا كنا نشوف المستوطنات اللي حوالينا قاعدة بتتوسع وبتكبر. اليوم خلال 6 أشهر هم بيصغروا واحنا اللي قاعدين بنتوسع وبنكبر.
Thamar is in strict adherence to safety, quality controls, and regulations in line with the local guidelines of the Palestinian Ministry of Agriculture, in addition to compliance with USDA regulations as an exporter to America. Thamar is a certified Global GAP farm.
هدف الشركة الأساسي لشركة ثمار هو إنتاج منتج عالي الجودة، مواصفات عالمية، بهدف التصدير لأسواق الخارج. اليوم قاعدين احنا نفتح سوق جديد في منطقة الخليج، وهي وسوق الخليج بركض أو يسعى إلى الجودة العالية في المنتج.
أنا كنت يعني قبل ما أجي هان كان وضعي سيء جدا، ولما وظفوني شركة ثمار الطبيعة وضعي صار أحسن، وأشتغل بكرامة وأكون مبسوط يعني بشغلي، وأنا يعني بشكر شركة ثمار الطبيعة كثير جدا.
خلال 18 سنة احنا كنا نشوف المستوطنات اللي حوالينا قاعدة بتتوسع وبتكبر. اليوم خلال 6 أشهر هم بيصغروا واحنا اللي قاعدين بنتوسع وبنكبر.
وبكفي انها شركة وطنية.
هذا المشروع ساعد كثير، وإن شاء الله إنه بيظل باستمرار.
بشكر شركة ثمار الطبيعية لأنها وفرت لي فرصة عمل.
So what I was trying to illustrate is there's hundreds of success stories despite the challenges, and I think in our own case we've invested in 150 companies across about 30 countries, and that's just a drop in the ocean of opportunity. There's thousands in this region, tens of thousands of businesses that either exist today that provide an investment opportunity or don't exist today that are probably an opportunity for people in this room and others. And I think this is ultimately what entrepreneurship is about: understanding the overall macro picture, identifying a unique opportunity within it, working on an execution plan to deliver on that opportunity. I think hopefully over the next couple of days we'll see a lot of these examples, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.